So if you could just, changing that slide. So please shut down all of your other browsers, documents or programs on your computer. That will help make the quality of the webinar better. Ensure that your speakers are turned up high and that the volume's up high. You can type questions as we go in the box on the lower right-hand corner, and if you could just keep them short and relevant to what's being talked about. We will feed those into the conversation, but we don't always get to answer all of them. If there are questions that we don't get to this evening, we give those questions to our facilitators and they'll often write blogs about them so that you can read their responses directly afterwards. If you have any trouble with the audio at all, you can switch to the telephone. So if your internet plays up at all, you can switch to the telephone. The settings are in the top right-hand corner and it will give you a local call number. And that means that you will be able to hear the webinar through the phone. So I'm going to hand over to Petrea now, and I hope you enjoy your webinar. Are you there, Petrea? Tim, are you there?
That you've got a cup of tea beside you or a glass of water, and that you can perhaps put your feet up for the next hour so that we can enjoy this. And let them know a little bit about where you come from as far as your professional background is concerned. And then it would also be lovely to hear a little about your personal experience. So welcome, Tim.
Hi, before I get started, can I just check that you can hear me okay?
I can hear you really well.
Oh, good. Sorry, it's just your audio is just dropping out a bit before when you were doing the introduction, but as long as you can hear me all right, then that's the main thing. So,
You will.
okay, good. Well, well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the introduction. As you can see on that slide, I hope you can see, my background's in psychology. I started out as a clinical psychologist and still practice as a clinical psychologist, but I spent most of the last 10 years or so practicing as what I'd call a positive psychologist, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. My main focus in recent years has been promoting the principles of positive psychology through my organisation, the Happiness Institute. And due to, I suppose, a particular personal event, which again I'll explain in a minute, I've been interested in the last couple of years on this issue of carers. Although I lie a bit actually, because it's not just the last few years. When I think back to my PhD research, which is 15 years or so ago, interestingly enough, that was looking at, we didn't call them carers, but we called them significant others of people with chronic pain. So I actually spent several years researching my PhD thesis, looking at the impact of living with someone with chronic pain and the responses that carers had, and the impact that had back on the chronic pain sufferer. So, so in short, my qualifications are in psychology, and I still practice as a clinician and as a coach. But should I go on to the personal experience?
Yeah, it'd be interesting if you can just paint a bit of a picture for us, Tim, of the kinds of people that we might have with us this evening, and we're really looking forward to having some input from some of the carers as well, whether you're a professional carer or a caring for a loved one at home. But it would be interesting, Tim, before we get into dealing with some of those issues, just to talk about, paint that picture of how many people in Australia are in that caring role.
Yeah, oh, well, it's well, not just in Australia, but around the world, it's a significant proportion of people. We know, if we look at the rates, for example, if we combine the prevalence rates for all the various types of chronic health problems, including, as I mentioned earlier, chronic pain, which is one of the most prevalent health problems, but also the range of cancers and cardiovascular disease. And then if we look at the quote unquote mental health problems, I mean, even if we just look at the psychological disorders, which is my main area of expertise, I suppose, roughly 1 in 4 people will suffer depression at some point in their lives. If you add to that the other common psychological disorders like the anxiety disorders, and then drug and alcohol problems, and then relationship difficulties and insomnia, etc., etc.
Yes.
I won't go on too much longer, but the estimates are that a significant proportion of people are either directly affected by physical or mental health problems, or indirectly affected by being a family member or friend of. So, we're literally talking about millions and millions of people in Australia who somehow or other care, either formally or informally, for people who are suffering.
Yes, yes. And of course, for a lot of them, they're bound to home and don't always have access to a lot of services. And
Well,
so they've got some very particular issues too that often restrict their ability to get assistance, which is why webinars can be so helpful, because we can come into your home instead of people having to come to us.
Well, very much so. If I follow on from what I was just saying about the number of people, which is, as I hinted, is significant. We're talking millions of people. What we also know, and the World Health Organization has looked into this, that a significant proportion of those people are suffering high levels of psychological distress themselves. So we're talking millions and millions of carers here, and of that, at least half, if not more than half, of themselves suffering because, as you said, Petrea, it's often isolating, it's stressful. There's a whole bunch of issues that go along with being a carer, which are quite both physically and psychologically demanding. And for a variety of reasons, geographical and time and even financial, unfortunately, the sad fact is that many of these people don't get the help they need, and that's part of what we're trying to target tonight, I suppose.
Yes, exactly. And the thing is, you can feel so alone in that someone on a daily basis. It can be such a lonesome kind of a job, and yet you actually belong to an enormous community of people who are often behind closed doors and not always able to access the kind of services that others can. So
Indeed, and you're not alone, but the feeling or the perception of being alone, that sense of loneliness is again, we know a significant cause of depression and psychological distress. So again, what we're trying to address today is people know, but also provide people with some skills to take care of themselves so they can take care of others.
Yes. And Tim, with your own personal experience of caring, did you find that your professional qualifications and experience really set you up for that, or was it a very unexpected experience for you in lots of ways?
Well, I'll go back a step and explain to our listeners what piqued my interest in this particular topic a year or two ago. As I've said, I've suggested that I have a professional interest in it, but I also had a very personal experience, which, for want of a better phrase, shook my world. About 18 months or 2 years ago, my lovely wife was diagnosed with breast cancer, unfortunately. Although I'll jump in straight away and say, thankfully, we got in early, and she's had treatment and doing very well now. But as some of our listeners will know, that was quite was a huge shock. It was quite traumatic and stressful for all of us. Initially, the diagnosis is shocking enough, but then the stresses and strains of all the things that then go along with that, the treatment, which is disrupting the stress and the worry about whether effective happen in 6 months and we have 2 relatively young children. So there's a whole bunch of stuff, and people actually said to her, or that she was lucky to have me, i.e., being a psychologist, around. But I have to say, it was the other way around, really. I was incredibly lucky to have an amazingly resilient wife, and I'll talk more about this later, because there's a significant feature of support is lots of family support around us. So we were not just lucky in getting in early and getting good treatment, but we were incredibly lucky to have fantastic family and friends who pitched in and helped with kids and helped with cooking and all those sorts of things. But whether my training helped or not, well, I guess it certainly made me more aware of what I should do. Whether I necessarily did it well or not at all times is another question. I tried my best, but you know, it was a very stressful time, you know, and I know what it's like. I had a taste of what it's like for some people, I suppose, compared to some out there, maybe some of our listeners. Mine was relatively short-lived. You know, I guess depending on how you look at it, it sort of went on for 6 to 12 months. I mean, it's still lingering in the background, but I know there are people out there for whom this sort of thing can go on for years and years, if not decades and decades, and I can't begin to imagine how distressing that could be.
And did you find, when you said it's still there in the background, did you find once the caring role had sort of completed that you had to adjust that consciously in the relationship? Because I know from our programs over the years, many people have said, you know, look, I've always thought of myself as his wife or his partner, not his carer, and it's a label that I'm not comfortable with and not familiar with. And I'm just wondering whether when that role changes again, whether there's a negotiation, or do you actually talk about it consciously, how the role is changing as you begin to resume more of the things that you used to do and less of the caring role?
Look, in our particular case, and I'll preface this by saying that, like a lot of the people I deal with in a lot of the areas I work in, there's no one right answer. So I can talk about what we did, and then I can sort of talk from a professional perspective. But you know, what worked for us won't necessarily work for everyone else out there. So that's an important caveat, I suppose. But in our case, we didn't necessarily have a formal conversation about it. As I said, I was lucky, you know, to have an amazingly resilient and a wife who copes incredibly well with everything, and coped incredibly well with this. And one of the things that she wanted to do, and we did talk about it, but she wanted to keep as busy as she could. Now there were times during the treatment where she got quite tired and had to rest more, but certainly one of the things that was most helpful for her was to keep busy, to keep distracted, and to keep as normal as we could, both for her and the kids. So I don't know if at any point in time we actively labelled me as the carer. It was just that I stepped in for a period of time to and took over some of the responsibilities, and I was pleased to be able to do that where I could.
So are you happy if we move on to talking about some of the issues that people who are in that caring role can face on a daily basis or an occasional basis? But is now a good time to start talking about some of those issues?
For sure, yep.
Because I know for a lot of people who just give selflessly for so many years, that their own needs can often slip completely off the agenda, and that the person that they're caring for seems to hold most of the needs in the house. And I guess it's very easy for people to stop doing some of the things that they know replenish them because the enormity of perhaps what's happened, or the enormity of the caring role, means that they've left some of those nurturing things for themselves completely aside. Has that been your experience as well?
Oh, very much so. It's it really is a tricky balancing act, I think. I remember early on, well, I guess in the very early stages, as in the first few days and weeks, it was all all the focus on my wife, as it should have been, and it was all about seeing the doctors and getting the diagnosis, or understanding what we needed to do. And to some extent, although it was very emotional, it was also very practical. We just had to, what are we going to do? When are we going to do it? Where do we have to be? And there was a lot of rushing around and meeting new doctors and trying to understand what they were saying, because they don't really speak English a lot of the time. But then once we sort of got into the routine of the well, there was the surgery. She had surgery and then daily radiotherapy for a couple of months. I do remember there were times when, and it's even hard for me to talk about it now because it's hard to. Well, anyway, there were times when again, all of the focus was on my wife, as it should have been, but there were times when I was thinking, well, hold on, I'm actually going through this well. This is actually a significant impact on my life, and I'm distressed. But then I remember, as soon as I thought that, I felt guilty about thinking that because
Yes.
I'm not the one with the disease. So I remember feeling sort of distressed and stressed and tired, but feeling that I couldn't actually tell anyone because I didn't want to. I would feel guilty if I distracted attention, and so and then the more I talked to people, I realized that was quite common. That for carers, it is a very difficult role. It's very stressful. It can at times. It's also very fulfilling, I should say. In a strange way, it's fulfilling to be able to give to someone and to give to a situation so well. But it's obviously quite distressing and stressful and tiring and disruptive. And yet, I think, like a lot of other people, I wasn't really able to, or didn't feel I was able to talk about that because. Instead, I felt guilty that it wasn't really about me, and I didn't want to draw the attention to me.
Yes, yes. And sometimes too, people can just be downright difficult to care for. I've known, I mean, this could be for a whole range of situations. The person may just be a grumpy person and be very challenging to look after, or may be very negative and always see the downside of everything. And it's so hard to maintain your kind of hope and positivity when you're constantly with someone who's negative. There are some people who just won't take their medications when they're meant to, or they eat the wrong foods that are really detrimental to their health, or they do things. I know many people who can't believe that someone with a serious illness, won't give up smoking or won't stop eating those foods or whatever. So sometimes it can be a very frustrating role to care for someone when they're perhaps doing a whole range of behaviours that you find challenging and difficult to love. And of course, not every relationship was in deep, crazy love about each other when whatever happened might have happened. And so suddenly you're thrust into perhaps a caring role when that was not what you ever expected, nor at all wanted to have happened.
Oh, very much so. Well, I guess I was lucky not to personally have had to face those two problems in that my wife was a very good patient, and thankfully we had a good, strong relationship before. But certainly, um, uh, when the first instance, even though she was a good patient and even though we had a good relationship, there were still times when we'd be irritated with each other anyway, because that's life.
Yeah.
And yet, because of the particular context, again, under normal circumstances, I might sort of say, well, hold on, I don't agree with this or I don't like it. Again, I felt guilty that, well, hold on, I can't say this because of these. And certainly as a clinician, as a therapist, I've, particularly that latter situation where if the relationship wasn't strong to begin with, and then if something like this comes along, a diagnosis or an illness or whatever it might be, that obviously in and of itself is a huge stressor, a major, major stressor. So if there's a strong relationship, that can sort of cope with it. But if the relationship is weak or sort of not, has been fractured in some way for some other reason before, then I have seen clients where one partner, would like to leave really, but then doesn't feel they can again. They feel tied in because of this particular context, and
Yes.
it can actually be very, very complicated for everyone involved.
Yes, and I wonder as we're talking whether any of our listeners can relate to some of these experiences, because I know sometimes people have a glorified view of caring, and certainly on radio just a few weeks ago we were with Richard Glover talking about loving people when it's difficult to love, and we had a caller that called in that I think everyone in Sydney was in tears about listening to her, because her husband was demented, but she goes to the hospital twice a day, every day, to sit with him, and she just spoke so lovingly of their 46 years together and the depth of their love for each other, and that if he looked at her, that was like the biggest gift that he could possibly give her, was just to even look at her. And I think everyone was so moved by such a story of love and enduring love. But of course, that's not the way it is for everyone. And sometimes When you mentioned before, there can be financial strains, there can be other things going on in your life beyond the caring role that you might have that really make the role very difficult to grapple with. And I think one of the first things that needs to happen is that we get to that place where we can accept that this is a role that we're going to be playing in our life, the role of caring, and that sometimes we need to go through all of the feelings of resistance around that or frustration around that. We might need to weep about it, rail about it, talk about it until we can get to a place where we recognize that this is the situation that we're in and that I need to care for this person whom I love and want to care for, or who I find challenging and difficult to care for. But then how am I going to create some space in my own life so that I can do that with a full heart, with a sense of humour, with some creativity, and with an ability to find, some of those creative solutions that you always need to find when you're caring for someone. And that means setting aside some time for yourself. And that's something that people resist.
Yeah, oh, look, I couldn't agree more, and certainly I think you're right. It's the first step is that accepting that this is the new role. This is a part of your life, whether it's for a few weeks or months or years, depending on the context. But and that, to be honest, for me, that was an easy decision. I know it's going to be harder for some people, but what was slightly harder for me, I suppose, was and again, I think having talked to lots of people over the last few years. I realise a lot of people go through this, is not just accepting the role, which for me, as I said, was simple enough, but to accept all but the full range of emotions and responses and reactions that went along with that, which, as I said, at times was satisfaction and fulfillment almost, and at times was pride because I felt I was doing a good job at times, but at other times was frustration and irritation and then guilt about feeling the frustration and irritation. So one of the first things that I sort of, and particularly in hindsight when I look back, that I think it would be really helpful is to accept not just the role but the full range of complex emotions that will go along with that and that will fluctuate from minute to minute and day to day and week to week.
Yeah, and to go a little bit easy on yourself and have a bit of compassion for yourself when you do get irritable. And one of our facilitators, Bernadette, often reminds us, she talks about just saying to yourself at those times, how human of me, instead of giving yourself a hard time, just how human of me, it's why wouldn't I be feeling like this?
Oh, I like that, right? That's yeah, and to be able to say, look, just because my wife happens to have an illness at this point in time, or whatever your particular situation is, that doesn't mean I'm not going to get upset at times. It doesn't mean, because what happened is I would get frustrated or angry, and then I'd feel guilt about the frustration or angry, and that would just exacerbate and snowball, and so I'd feel more negative emotions at times. So yeah, to accept that it's actually okay, it's human, as you said, how human of me to experience these emotions. Because if you stop and think, then it's almost it seems ridiculous that I would have thought I wouldn't have those sorts of emotions. It's completely unrealistic. So I think that's actually one of the first things that certainly as I've talked to people, and in fact I had a several-hour conversation with a man going through a similar situation that you actually referred on to me a few months ago at the end of last year, Petrea, and I remember that was one of the main things we talked about, that it was it's actually okay to be experiencing all these different things you're experiencing. There's no right or wrong. Because until you can accept them, you can't then really deal with them.
Exactly. And that's why workshops and hopefully webinars and our residential programs are so helpful, because you're just in that environment where you can say whatever you need to say and no one's going to judge you, and you're amongst people who kind of understand your suffering, even though it might be different, because they've got their own suffering. And so it's often very hard, though, isn't it, for carers to reach out and get help, or to put themselves into environments where they can share what their journey is like as a carer. Because oftentimes when a carer can create a little bit of free time, that's when they want to go to a movie or go to the hairdresser or go do anything other than perhaps think more about the caring role and how they might do it better. So I hope some of the people who are with us tonight can overcome that hurdle and recognize that in order for you to be able to do a good job of being a carer, you really need to put yourself first, which I imagine for a lot of our listeners tonight is a completely foreign concept because their day is full of caring for somebody else. But if you're always giving from a half empty bucket, you know, if you always feel like you're giving to everybody else and your bucket's only half full, you begin to resent what you're giving to other people that you haven't really given to yourself, or you get completely burnt out. And in a way, the best way to be in the caring role is to know yourself well enough to know how to fill up your own inner bucket so that you're only ever giving from the overflow. And then you'll find you're as fresh at the end of the day as you are at the beginning. But you need to set aside, prioritize your time so that you really do attend to whatever it is that replenishes you, that refreshes you, and that enables you to continue keeping on giving in an environment which will really take as much of your time and energy as you might have to give. So how do you find, Tim, do you have any suggestions around how people make it a real priority for themselves to look after their own needs?
Yeah, well, very much so, and I couldn't agree more. And it's there's an old cliche that's often used in these situations, but it's used so many times because it's a nice one, and it makes so much sense. And that's the the metaphor that's often used of the airplane safety instructions about put on your own mask first, and then care for your children or loved ones. And
that's an excellent one.
It is a bit cliche, but it is an excellent one, and it's so true because I remember there were times when I sort of thought, God, I just need to get out and go to the footy or go to out with my mates.
Yeah.
And luckily, my wife was very supportive. She was often encouraging me, to go and do this at times. Not every night, I should say, but but it was more that I thought, well, God, if I go to do that, that's a bit selfish, isn't it? And I think this is to answer your question, one of the first things we need to understand is that I think too many people see selfishness and selflessness as mutually exclusive constructs when I think that actually when they're done properly, they can actually be integrated and be one and the same thing. So if all I do is look after myself, if all I ever did was go to the footy every night or go to the movies or the pub every night, well, that would have been selfishness. But the other extreme is that, and as you hinted at earlier, if all I did is look after, in this case, my wife or whoever you care for all the times, to the extent that you actually get burnt out and exhausted, well, that's actually not sustainable over the long term and therefore not helpful either. In order to make it a priority, we need to understand that by caring for myself, I'm not being selfish, because ultimately by caring for myself, I will then be able to care better for my loved one. And so then the selfishness and the selflessness actually become not mutually exclusive, but mutually beneficial, because again, as you said, if I fill up my bucket, I've got more to give the other, whoever that other person is. So how do we make it a priority? Well, I think the first thing, certainly for me and for many people, is to redefine what caring for myself means. That caring for myself, again, is not selfishness. It's actually it is in my interest, but it's also in my wife's interest. And it's in what's in the interest of the carer is also in the interest, ultimately, of the person being cared for. Because until we can think about it like that, then it will always see, if it seems like it's an act of selfishness, then that will lead to guilt, and that will lead to not doing it properly. So I think that's the first step, is making sure we define it in a helpful, constructive way, and then it becomes a bit easier.
Yes, I think the greatest gift you can give your family or your loved one or your children or your workplace or the world is the gift of your own good physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual health. And if you don't attend to that, chances are no one else will either. And, so for carers, it's so important that they make sure that they address the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual needs that they have, because then you maintain your sense of humor, your creativity, you have access to boundless energy, You have all of those things that you need to really be present to someone who's perhaps really suffering. And taking your irritable, exhausted, overwhelmed, frustrated self into a challenging circumstance when you're caring for someone else is not going to work near so well, nor be near so sustainable as when you really have your own resilience in good shape. I know though, for a lot of our listeners, they might say, well, that sounds terrific in theory. And I'm not pretending for a moment that it's an easy thing to put into place. But hopefully through the webinar tonight and more particularly in the workshop that we've got coming up on the 3rd of March at the Colling Institute, people will really gain that real confidence in knowing that it's good, more than okay, to put their own needs first so that they really replenish themselves. I think another thing that we'll certainly be talking about in the workshop will be around mindfulness and just being present moment by moment throughout the day, rather than letting all of the things in the future crowd in on the present moment, or all of the things in the past, all of the things that I could be doing, should be doing, ought to be doing, or all of the thoughts about projecting our fears and worries and anxieties into the future, but just learning to be more mindful and more present and dealing with what's right happening in the present moment. Because even though, I imagine some of our listeners do have the odd cup of tea and maybe sit on a back veranda or sit in their favourite chair and just have a moment to themselves. But it's really important when you're having those moments to yourself that you're present to it, because you can sit in the early morning sunshine with a cup of tea but never feel the warmth of the sun unless you're really present to it. So I think that being present is a huge boon, where we don't drag the frustrations and resentments and weariness from one moment into the present moment, that we can leave that aside and just deal with what is right in front of us.
Very much so, and just to take that back to the point you just made previously, which is that I'm glad you said that we don't want to suggest this is easy. If this were easy, there wouldn't be millions and millions of people out there suffering. If this were easy, we wouldn't need to run this webinar or run the workshop. So right. It is it's easier said than done. It's much more complex, and one of the reasons it's complicated is that there's never one right thing to do. And so even if I work out the right thing to do today, it'll change tomorrow and it'll change again next week. And even if I work out the right thing to do today and next week, it'll be a different thing for you and a different thing for our listeners. So, but this is where I think mindfulness comes in, because the more mindful we can be as often as possible, the more we can fully see the situation for what it is and isn't, and the more we can then work out the most appropriate way to deal with that, rather than just sort of knee-jerk reactions. And so mindfulness, I think the reality, I think both you and I agree, mindfulness is really the cornerstone of living a good life in all contexts, really. It's a cornerstone of coping not just with difficult situations, but also creating a fulfilling and happy life as well. So it's certainly something that I would advocate the practice of as often as possible, and certainly something we'll be focusing on in our workshop in a couple of weeks.
Yes, because, meditation's like that formal practice that you might take every day just to sit quietly with yourself. But mindfulness can be brought into every moment of your waking day, and it can actually completely transform your life. And you begin to appreciate the small things in much greater detail. And I think, it's so obvious to any of us who've gone through our own suffering, whatever that might be, that it's our minds that can really create complete and utter chaos. They can create misery and suffering for us because they have a tendency to get preoccupied with all the things that might happen, could happen, probably won't happen, or we're regretting or rehashing or chewing over things from the past. And so it's really about bringing your mind to rest so that you can just enjoy what is in the present moment, rather than being completely absorbed in the future or in the past. And it's often too when you are mindful and present, that's often when creative solutions come up to some of these very challenging uh, situations. I remember many years ago, there was a little boy in my life, Charlie, who I've written about in Sometimes Hearts Have to Break. And Charlie was 10 when he was dying. And, being with his family, I actually moved into the household in the last couple of weeks of his life so that just to kind of be there in the background to facilitate what was happening for the family, because there were a couple of teenagers in the household as well. And Charlie had enormous amounts of pain. To this day, 90,000 people down the track, Charlie still had more pain than any other person I've ever been with. And when he would get this pain, it was very much like a labor contraction. And everyone would disappear. His father couldn't bear being so close because he was obvious that his son was in so much pain and he couldn't help him, he couldn't fix it. His mum would be off drawing up morphine. And if I just became really quiet in those circumstances, what I began to see, for instance, was that Charlie didn't get cuddled any longer. He had his hand held constantly and his brow stroked, but he never really got cuddled because he had a suprapubic catheter in, and he was very thin and tiny at this time and in so much pain. But I asked him, why don't we sit you forward in the bed and I'll straddle the bed behind you and then pull you up onto my chest so that he could just rest in someone's arms rather than having people just hold his hands. Well, he absolutely adored it, and from then until he died, 2 weeks later, 24 hours a day, he lay in someone's arms. And at night he lay in my arms so that his family could sleep. But during the day, his brother and sister and father and mother all took it in turns of getting into bed with Charlie and just being so close to him. And it's sometimes not until you're willing to just be still and present in those very challenging circumstances that you come up with some of the creative solutions. That doesn't mean that you change the outcome. Charlie certainly still died of his disease, but it changed the way the whole family experienced the outcome. And I think that's a tremendously important part of this, is how do we conduct this journey so that we can give with compassion, that we can keep on giving when we've got perhaps so many other things that we would prefer to be doing. How do we keep on giving and loving when it's very lonesome and very challenging to do so? So I think, some of the things that we're going to be exploring in the workshop are so profoundly practical for people, and hopefully with the motivation and putting these things into practice, it can transform some of the exhaustion that can be so present in caring into something that's far more resilient.
Oh, thanks. Well, that's it's a beautiful story, and I think one of the other lessons from that is that as traumatic and as distressing as that situation must have been, that family was lucky, dare I say it, to have numerous people involved and to have your support. And I'd say that's one other thing that that I think we can all learn from that, is that none of us can do it on our own, or it's extremely difficult to do on our own. And we often try to, and as I hinted at earlier, we often feel guilty if we feel we need to ask for help, and yet we shouldn't feel guilty because, as we've said a few times, we're just human, and there's a limit to what we can do. None of us can be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if we can enlist the support of others, and I know that's easier said than done, and some people are geographically isolated and don't necessarily have supportive families, or there's all sorts of reasons that might make this a bit harder to do. But if you can, if you do have family, friends, professionals, whoever it might be, then please use them. Don't feel guilty about using them, because it's hard to be helpful if you're sick and tired all the time, if you're exhausted, if you run down. And this goes back again. We need to look after ourselves so we can then look after the other person. If you get to the point where you're so exhausted that you're getting irritable, stroppy yourself, well, it's not in your interest, and it's not really going to help the other person either.
Yeah, and sometimes we're our own worst enemy because I know I have a very strong pattern of I do it myself, and sometimes there are people who are offering help, and we say, "Oh no, look, I'm fine, thank you." And so, if there are people in your life who are offering any kind of help, ask them. You know,
Mm.
if you were to ask someone that you love, who you could see was having a really hard time because they were caring for someone, if there was something you could do and they said, no, no, I'm fine, then it just feels like someone shut the door in your face. So,
Mm.
if there are people for any of our listeners who are offered assistance, then take them up on it. You'll soon find out who the really genuine people are. And I think that's another thing too. Many people find that some of the people that they thought would really be able to hang in with them through the journey fall away because they find it too hard, and they just don't want to be there. They don't know how to be there. And sometimes new people will come into your life that become absolute stalwart friends because they know how to be in the hard places, and they know that it's okay to turn up even when you might not know what to say or what to do, because they're willing to be there anyway. I'm just wondering, Kate, I imagine, is still in the background. I haven't seen any questions come up, and that might be because my screen isn't showing questions, but I'm just wondering if any of our listeners have any particular questions they'd like to raise this evening so that we can incorporate some of those into our conversation this evening. So feel free, just if you can keep it fairly short and to the topic, that would be terrific.
Petrea,
And
there are
otherwise,
there are actually some questions here, so I'm not sure why they're not showing up on your screen. So maybe I can just feed some of those in if that's okay.
that,
Oh,
that would be terrific. Your voice has gone very, very strange and funny, but that's
You
fine.
sound like Stephen Hawking.
oh, is that any better or is it still
Do you want
strange?
to give us one of the questions, Kate?
I will paste them into the chat
That's
box,
better.
Petrea.
No, that's
Right.
better.
Okay. Wendy has asked a couple of questions, and you've touched on some of them already, but one particularly around how do you explain to friends and relatives that you need support? Because sometimes they think that they're helping, but the focus is all on the person that you're caring about.
Oh, now you sound like you've developed a disease.
I'm going to cut and paste them into the chat box, and hopefully you'll be able to read them there.
Okay. Can I encourage you? Can I suggest that you put it in the chat box because your voice went very, very strange then. We thought you developed motor neurone disease or something suddenly. So we'll incorporate some of those when they come up. Is there anything else, Tim, just about the day that's coming up on the 3rd of March that you wanted to say, just while we're waiting for
Oh,
those to come in?
sure. We'll only that the plan is that we'll discuss all of these issues we discussed tonight, but in more detail. But also, and I think that's an important point for listeners, we'll be going into more detail about the practicalities of what you can do. So we'll be doing mindfulness and meditation practice. I'll be touching on a bit more detail some of the positive psychology strategies that I talk a lot about in other contexts now, but which I found helpful, including mindfulness and meditation, but including how to maintain hope and optimism during some of the dark days. How
Can you
to
say
ask for.
can you say a
Sorry.
little about positive psychology? That might be a new term for some of our
Oh,
listeners.
oh, okay. Yes. Well, most people are probably familiar with clinical psychology or counselling or therapy, which is, there are different varieties, I suppose, but they're all designed in one way or other to help people address and overcome problems and adversity and things like depression and anxiety and stress. Um, the positive psychology, which has been around now for roughly 15 years or so, says in simple terms, and I'm oversimplifying, that although that's important, there's actually much more we can do, because we've always assumed that if we address distress, then that will somehow be as good as it gets. But what positive psychology is saying is that addressing distress is only the first part of it. That's kind of like getting someone from -10 to 0. But the question is, why would we stop there? And so positive psychology is saying, yes, if someone's down at -10, we do want to get them back to 0, but let's also try and get them not just from -10 to 0, but to 0 to +10. So rather than just about alleviating distress, it's more about promoting the living of a really fulfilling and flourishing life. Now, in this context, people might say, well, how can I live a flourishing, thriving life when my loved one is sick or ill or possibly even dying? And I would say, well, it's even more important there. I would say it's certainly harder, but we need to be making the most of every minute we have. And the more that we're flourishing and thriving during difficult circumstances, the better for everyone involved. It doesn't mean you won't have difficult days. It doesn't mean you won't experience distress. It's about being the best we can, given what we've got and given the surroundings that we're in. So it builds on a lot of the fantastic work that's been done for decades and decades in all various forms of therapy, but it extends a lot of it further. And it's really about promoting full health and wellness and flourishing and thriving, despite whatever's going on around you, or taking into account whatever is going on around you.
You know, Tim, our little question box is filling up so fast. So there are some things that I'd love to be able to focus on a couple of the callers who've made contact with us. One of them, Wendy, has asked, how do you explain to friends and relatives that you need support? Because they think they're helping out by taking someone out for an hour, her mum in this case, out for an hour, and the focus is on her rather than really being able to look after what Wendy might actually need in the circumstance. It's often difficult, isn't it, to articulate to other people what you need. And I know I was talking with a young mum today who was saying, you know, at the end of the day, she used to accomplish so much, and if she got the dishwasher unpacked, then she realised that she'd accomplished something, but it was very different from usual. But how do you let family or friends know that you're actually in need of their support, and for them to understand what that means in very practical ways?
Yeah, well, look, that's a really important question, and not necessarily an easy one to answer because it will vary so much. And I mean, I think the simple answer is we all need to be as assertive as we can be, and that means, you know, stating our needs and expressing it as clearly and effectively as we can. But I think what it also means is tailoring it for that particular person, because certainly what we found, and you sort of hinted at this earlier, that sometimes we're surprised by the people that do really chip in and by those that don't. And there's all sorts of reasons why they don't, why some people might not help as much as you'd expect them to. And, you know, it's not necessarily that they don't care. There might be other issues that they're dealing with. But I suppose a part of the answer to that is to, again, tailor your requests. And so for some people, it might be a matter of keeping it really practical. And, you know, if you can cook a meal, then that will be fantastic.
Yes.
So some people will be able to provide very practical support. Other people might be able to provide more emotional support, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess one of the answer to the question is to try and work out what these different people might be in a position to offer. If we're lucky enough to have more than one of them.
Yes, if we're lucky enough indeed. And Pam says too that others need to be equipped to help though, and not everyone knows what to do or how to help. And I imagine for Pam and for many others, sometimes it's just easier to do it yourself because you know the routine of what needs to happen, and trying to explain it to somebody else becomes really difficult. And Pam also raises the issue about midwife for the dying, which was a label that was given to me back in the 80s. And of course, I think of myself as someone who helps people to live rather than just helping people to die. But I've always thought that we need to have midwives for the dying, so that there are people who can just be comfortable being in the background, but making sure that everybody's needs are looked after, and that everything unfolds in the very best way possible for everyone concerned. And some of our listeners may not know, and may be in a circumstance where an organisation called Life Circle could be of help, because they provide mentoring for people who are caring for someone who's dying at home. So if any of our listeners this evening are looking after someone who is dying, then Life Circle can provide a whole range of resources and mentoring, just so that you don't have so much aloneness in that. So you'll find them at lifecircle.org.au. And Elizabeth says she's looking after a dad, and what can I do when he needs assistance? A doctor, painkillers, home help, but he refuses to agree. Oh, Elizabeth, yes, our hearts are with you. In fact, we've just been through precisely this thing in our own family, and it's finding that balance between respecting the other person's way to conduct their journey, and that might be by not seeing doctors, by not asking for assistance, by not taking anything for pain or whatever. How much of it do you respect the person's rights and wishes to choose, make their own choices and experience the consequences of that? But then when it impacts on your health and on how you feel, it can be a very, very difficult area, because, you know, it's like when someone has an illness, it doesn't just happen to the person with the illness, it happens to everyone that that person loves as well. And so I think it's absolutely appropriate to perhaps have those conversations that say, look, there are two of us involved in this, and given that there are two of us involved, we need to, and I need to be here for the long haul. How are we going to do that in a way that's going to be sustainable into the future? But I don't think we're going to come up with any easy solutions for you tonight, Elizabeth, because that's a very, very challenging situation, but a great one to go into in much greater depth in our workshop. We also have a residential program, a 3-day residential program coming up for carers in a couple of months as well. So all of the information about that will be on the last slide, and you can access further information on the website. I'm just a little bit aware of the time, and perhaps we've got time just for one more question from the audience. Just from Ingeborg, who says, how best do you care for someone without insight into their illnesses, and when to hand over professionals against the will of the patient? A little bit like what we were talking about with Elizabeth. And that's a very complex one, and I wouldn't even for a moment begin to think that we could address it in any proper way, Ingeborg, with just a minute or so to go before we begin to wrap up. But something that we really hope that you'll be able to come to the workshop in March and share with us on that day. Tim, I need to thank you for being with us this evening and sharing some of your own journey and also your professional insights into a lot of this. And I really so much look forward to working with you in March when we host the day together at Royal North Shore Hospital at the Collins Institute. And I'll look forward to no doubt meeting with you between now and then. So thank you so much for being with us this evening.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all of our attendees. I hope you found that helpful and at least a brief insight into what we hope to cover on the day. I hope to see some of you on the day, because certainly on March 3 we'll be able to go into some of these questions and some of these issues in much more detail, and as I said, in a much more practical way. We can actually we'll actually be teaching the practice of much of what we talked about. So thank you for having me, and yes, I'll be looking forward to working with you in the lead up and on the day, Petrea, as always. I'm sure it'll be fantastic.
Lovely. Thank you, Tim.
And thanks Kate, also thanks to Kate for helping with everything.
Yeah. Thank you, Kate. And are you going to take over just for this last little bit?
I'm a little bit scared that I might contract another illness. Am I?
No, you sound fine now.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'll just add thanks to everyone who's been with us this evening. I did want to mention just a couple of things about the work of the Quest for Life Foundation. As you may be aware, Quest for Life run residential programs in the Southern Highlands in Bundanoon. We also run community programs around the country and have recently done quite a bit of work around disaster and emotional recovery after natural disasters in Australia. We also run corporate programs. So if you have a workplace and you're interested in Quest programs coming into your workplace, we can certainly help you with those. Petrea obviously has a range of books and CDs that are available, and we have some free resources on our website that are about resilience. There are also other resources such as short meditation practices and a lot of articles that can help supplement the conversation that's happened this evening. We have a thriving social media community, as does the Happiness Institute, and I know that Tim's very active on social media, so we'd love you to join with us on Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and our blog regularly talks about issues that we've also been discussing this evening. As Petrea mentioned, there are the 2 workshops that are coming up, one on the 3rd of March, which is a one-day workshop with Petrea and Tim, and then there's a 3-day residential program, and all of the information about those is on the website. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. We have recorded this evening and it will be up on our website in the next few days. Thank you and have a lovely evening.